Okay, I'm going to take this video. I want to do a little thought experiment, as it were, at least my mundane version of one. What I want to do is talk about the different types of strength and how developing those different types of strength can contribute to optimal performance on any particular end of the strength spectrum. And for the purposes of this thought experiment, we'll define that as you have starting strength on one end, which is literally the amount of force you can produce just before movement begins. And then you have explosive force coming next, and that is essentially the speed at which you can produce a high rate of force of production. So in other words, if you have, I think with a jump, I want to say, and if I'm remembering this correctly, it's 0.15 to 0.18 milliseconds is roughly the time frame you have when you do the dip before you actually, that quick dip and then the actual jump. And in that time frame, the individual who can produce the greatest amount of force that quickly is going to be the one who jumps the highest. So that's explosive force, and then you have, or explosive strength, I'm sorry, and then you have going along the spectrum, what is speed strength, which is essentially again a fast rate of force development, or being able to move a load, a moderate load, very fast. So it's kind of the next step, if you will. And then you go all the way to the opposite end, which is maximal strength. And again, for the purposes of this discussion, this little thought experiment, that's the far end, because that's maximal volitional strength or force production. You could always hook somebody up with some electrodes and stimulate the muscle tissue and produce an even greater force, but you can't do that, obviously, with your mind just willing yourself to do it. So maximal strength will be defined that way. Anyway, so if you, part of the kind of underlying principle of the West Side training philosophy and Louis Simmons's work is that you develop that entire strength spectrum simultaneously, and when you do so, you can reap the greatest benefits. So this translates to everything from powerlifting, in other words, pure strength type sports, to any sort of athletic endeavor. And I think that's a major part of the reason why Louis is so successful with all different types of athletes. So in terms of the thought experiment, I was going to try to think about, envision a squat as it's performed, and how different types of strength development and optimizing those could aid the absolute amount you could squat, as an example of what I'm talking about here. So if we envision the lifter stands up with the barbell, loaded barbell on their back, gets into position, commences the eccentric phase. As you're going down, that's a yielding strength, and there's a term for that which is completely escaping me at the moment. But I would say that's a function of maximal strength, in the sense that it's not necessarily about rate of force production, because you're going to produce, essentially, the lower weight under control, you're producing just under the amount of force required to keep that barbell stationary in space. So that's what's allowing it to therefore travel downward. And that's part of the reason, by the way. And in fact, as a side note, part of the reason that you can lower actually about 40. I've seen estimates 40 to 50% more than you can raise concentrically. And one of the theories behind that has to do with intramuscular friction. In other words, when the ratcheting of the myofibrils, the actin and myosin, when they're ratcheting along, that as they're reversing the ratcheting, you get increased friction, and that actually aids the amount of force being produced. So, but that's theory. That's not necessarily an absolute proven fact. Anyway, so you lower down the weight, you get into the position where you're just getting into the hole. And by the way, Louis talks about, remember I told you this is kind of a free-form thinking process. Louis talks about with squats, or with any kind of movement, the faster down, the faster up. And they've done experiments at his gym with Tendo units, which actually measure the speed. And the faster that a squat was lowered, the faster it came up, invariably, across the board with athletes. And that gets into, by the way, if you lower a load quickly, you are building up, because as you're lowering it, you're stretching. In other words, like the involved musculature is getting, it's contracting, but it's getting stretched throughout the range of motion as you're lowering it primarily. And that in doing so, you're building up elastic energy in the connective tissues, the muscle tissue itself, that whole mechanism. You're starting to build up elastic energy, much like if you stretched a rubber band and then you let it go. It snaps back because you've built up elastic energy because it's resisting it. And you get a similar phenomena in the soft tissues as you're squatting downward. And so therefore, the faster you do that, the faster you stretch it, the more of that elastic energy you build up. And that gets translated into a rebound. And if you're ever watching an Olympic lifter squat, they take advantage of this wonderfully. Olympic lifters have a relatively narrow stance, and they squat extremely deep because they have to, because when they catch a barbell in space, whether it's a snatch or clean and jerk, they have to drop way down to get underneath it, especially as the loads go up, because you're only going to be able to lift with a certain degree of force, or speed of extremely heavy barbell. So you have to learn to be able to very quickly get underneath it. But that puts you in a plastered bottom position. You have to be able to power out of that. So anyway, when they squat, if you watch, most of them will go down with a pretty good rate of speed, and they'll literally get that rebound effect, which is what I was just talking about, even taken to the next level, because now you're actually getting some tissue rebound. You're kind of bouncing the hamstrings and the calves. You're literally getting some rebound effect there, and that helps to drive them out of the hole and complete the repetition. So that yielding with good speed on the concentric phase allows you to build up some additional force for the concentric phase. As you switch the movement from the concentric phase to the eccentric phase, that reactive strength, in other words, switching from the two different phases from lengthening to contracting, that is also a type of strength. So obviously, if you can increase that type of strength, you've helped yourself just at the very beginning of the ascent of a squat. Now, rate of force or explosive strength, which involves that high rate of force development very quickly, again, that comes into play at that point, if we're thinking, because when you switch from the lengthening to the contraction, you have to, that switch around is literally reversal. You have to then be able to generate a lot of force very quickly to get that barbell moving. And the greater the force, in other words, just again for a little thought process, if 100 pounds of force is required to get the barbell moving, if you can generate 200 pounds of force very quickly, you're now accelerating that barbell at a very quick rate. You're producing so much more force than is required to actually move it that you're experiencing enhanced acceleration. And that, of course, creates momentum, which can, when you get, because of the leverage of a squat, just as you come out of the hole, you're in the kind of weakest position. If you can generate a lot of force very quickly, you can help power through that position. And again, we talked about the elastic helping you out, etc. But now we're just talking about pure rate of force production on the concentric phase, the contraction. But if you're able to develop a very high level of explosive strength, you can accelerate that barbell, and that will aid you in completing the lift. So even though explosive strength is nearly the opposite end of the spectrum from maximal strength, and again, explosive strength has to do with speed of rate of force development, not maximal rate of force development, how quickly you can produce a high level of force. You can see now where that can aid you in the lift. And then it kind of continues up the strength spectrum. Then you get into speed strength. And again, speed strength, now we're talking about, I talked about speed with a moderate barbell, but speed strength can influence essentially, again, is being able to develop a high rate of force in a relatively short period of time. And again, now we're talking about a higher rate of force because you do have a longer period of time than you do with explosive strength. So now, if you can develop that speed strength, now again you can continue to accelerate that barbell. Again, this is all assuming you have the ability to move the barbell in the first place. You can now continue to accelerate that barbell even further. Now, another thing about strength and actual lifting has to do with time. You can only produce maximal force for a certain period of time, and that's fairly limited. So if you are sitting there, like when you're grinding through a lift, if you're grinding and grinding and grinding, comes a point where your peak force production is going to start to taper off. And then if you're barely producing enough force to move the barbell in the first place, and it's starting to taper off, you're going to miss the lift. So again, if when we're talking about all these different types of rate of force production, the faster you can get up to higher and higher levels of force production, which is working those different ends of the strength spectrum, then the greater the likelihood you can complete the lift. And then, of course, we move all the way through to maximal strength, which obviously plays an important part when you're talking about a maximal lift, because now you've got a greater period of time to develop peak force, and it's all about how much peak force can you develop, and that will. And by the way, that peak force does have some overlap to the other. In other words, if you can increase your maximal force production, then the amount of force you can produce explosively, speed, strength, etc., typically goes up. Now, there have been some studies showing that there's a limitation like that. Only so much affects these others. But I think it's Louis' belief, and I definitely believe that if you develop them all simultaneously, they all move up. So you can your kind of peak ability to produce explosive strength, speed, strength, etc., is correlated, is highly tied to how much peak force you can produce. So that's enough for now. It was a lot of babbling. You may or may not want to watch this. I may or may not put it online. But if you do watch it and you have thoughts or questions, feel free to make comments if I do post this. Thank you.